Hello, and welcome to this episode of Stories That Shape Us. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Thank you for those over YouTube who are tuning in, who are listening, who are watching, who are reaching out. Thank you so much. So, today I'm talking about fearful, avoidant, and boundaries. Different attachment patterns, different attachment, people with different attachment patterns might view boundaries in different ways. They might see boundaries as something to avoid, or some might embrace. So, for example, somebody with secure attachment who has there was love and connection in the caregiving relationship. They are okay with aloneness and separateness, and there's a settledness in relationships. Might find boundaries a little bit easier to set and to maintain than people with insecure attachment pattern. And a couple of days ago, I dealt with insecure attachment pattern and boundaries. And today, specifically, I want to look on the person who has a fearful avoidant attachment pattern and what boundaries might look like for this person. So people who grew up with fear with fear of with the space that is supposed to be safe, be fearful. So your safe space was also your fearful space. Might struggle with boundaries because boundaries might be seen as conflict. That's something that's going to generate conflict, and conflict might be there might be a warning sign on anything that says, if I say no, then there'll be a lot of sometimes emotional reasoning happening, a lot of cognitive distortions as well, mind reading, lots of those things might be happening. If I say no, then they will do this, I will do that, and we're going to have a conflict. And boundaries doesn't have to be conflict. Conflict doesn't have to be conflict. Boundaries doesn't have to be connected with conflict. But when you're afraid of creating anything that feels unsafe in your body, and it's going to be a body thing, not necessarily your mind, where we feel rejection, we feel fear, we feel rejection. And so anything that feels like it's going to threaten that might be problematic for somebody who's fearful avoidant. So not allowed when you were a child growing up in the system where with your caregivers, because the safe space was the fearful space, you were not allowed to say no. You were not allowed to have a space that was yours. You were not allowed to say no. You were not allowed to disagree with parents. You were not allowed to do any of those things. And so there's no practice in boundary setting. There's no practice in knowing what about you or yours should be respected. And so that's something that needs to be learned in order for you to be able to successfully set boundaries. So also, when you grew up in a home where there was fear, there may have been a lot of conflict in the home. There may be domestic abuse in the home. There may be lots of physical harm that came to you in that home. And so there's a lot of fear around that. So anything that has a whiff of conflict, you will stay away from. Anything that has a whiff of conflict. And so boundaries might feel like that. Now, it doesn't mean that you don't need boundaries. You do, because we all do. Every healthy relationship has boundaries. It needs it. Every healthy relationship needs boundaries. Relationship needs boundaries in order to function healthily, in a healthy way. Without that, the relationship's not healthy. Any relationship you have with someone without any boundaries, it's not a healthy relationship. If you can't say no in the relationship, if you can't say yes and be content, if you can't say no and there's no pushback, if you are not respected, if your opinion is not listened to, valued, validated, if none of those things are happening, not necessarily validated, but listened to and valued, valid, your opinion, you're not given the space to express your opinion, then it's not a safe relationship. If you're not being heard, and if you can't hear the next person, then the relationship is not safe. If it's not a relationship where where there can be some mutual agreement, where you can talk, where you can agree on, when you say this is what is okay with me and that is heard, then that's not a safe relationship. If the things that you say is ignored, dismissed, pushed against, don't adhere to, it's not a safe space. And that might be tough to hear depending on the person and the people that you're in relationships with, your friends, your husband, your partner, your parents, your leader, church, your boss at work. But if your opinions and views are not valued rather, or heard, if there is gaslighting in that relationship where when you give your opinion and your views, it's pushed back at, that relationship is not safe and it needs some work. If you're at work, that's when HR gets called in. If it's church, then there's the board meeting or complaint to an elder or something. If it's your relationship, your romantic relationship counseling. If it's with your children and they're adult children, and this is the dynamic in the relationship, it needs therapy to family counseling. It needs, if it's in your sibling relationships, there's some conversation that needs to happen, and maybe family therapy if people are agreeable to it, but there definitely conversation needs to happen. So it doesn't matter which relationship these things are showing up in, it really does needs help. If the space is not safe for you to express yourself and for you to say how you feel and for you to ask for what you need and for those needs to be considered and met where they can, then it's not a safe, healthy space, right? So part of setting boundaries is saying, I need this. I need you to do this. I feel this way when you do that. Please stop. Please don't do it. If you can't, if the space is not safe enough for you to do that and for that to be heard and acted upon, then it's not a safe space. But as a fearful avoidant, you might be afraid of doing it because the pushback, and you know the people. So sometimes you might look at people's body language, you might look at their tone, and because of their body language, their facial expression and their tone, you will work out that I'm not going to do that, because if I do, then they're going to be upset. Let them be responsible for how they feel. It's important that you're able to express yourself, to say what you want, to say how you feel, and to ask for what you need. Really is important, because relationships that we're not allowed to do that. So you might have made a decision that you're not going to, it's not sustainable. It's going to become a really hard task, and it's going to make the relationship eventually become unsafe and unhealthy and not a nice place for anybody to be in. Where if you're fearful avoidant and you've identified as fearful avoidant attachment pattern, and you're in a relationship romantically that you cannot set boundaries, you cannot express yourself, there's always pushback and your needs are not met, you can't meet you're gaslighted, I want you to consider getting help and talking to someone so that you can understand, because that would be a very unhealthy space for you to be in. Because we can't successfully deny ourselves what we need. We can't successfully live a healthy, happy, settled life without setting boundaries. We can't. And any person in any relationship that would deny you that would be abusive. And you need some support in understanding that so you can decide on your next steps. Okay. So also in a dynamic like this with a fearful avoidant, other people might have the power in the relationship, because that was what was happening when you were growing up in your caregiving relationship, where the attachment pattern was developed. The adults had power and you had no power, so you couldn't ask, you couldn't say, you couldn't request. And it's the same thing if you're in a romantic relationship and all the power somebody else has. Any power imbalance that is continuing, the relationship will become unhealthy and abusive. And so it's really important for you to understand and look at the dynamics and to be honest. And I know that hearing this, looking at your relationship and seeing yourself reflected in what I've said might be difficult to be with. And that's okay. When we're knowing something and hearing it, not for the first time, but when we're putting a name on what we feel, that can be challenging. But that's okay. Don't let that be not a reason to reach out for support, to get some help, to read the book, to understand it better, and to get support in understanding what fearful avoidant means in terms of your relationship currently and the things that you can do to begin to set boundaries and to maintain them long term. And if you're getting long term pushback, then something is wrong in that relationship that needs addressing, and you can't fix it. You might not be able to fix it on your own. Everybody must want to participate in having that fixed for it to be successfully fixed. So this ties up our series on boundaries. All of this week I was looking at boundaries in parenting, and so this ties up our series on boundaries. So stay with us in Stories That Shape Us, and I'm going to continue a new series from tomorrow. Thank you. Take care.